July 1944. A damp, muddy bivouac near Luneville, France. A group of American soldiers gathers around a stack of supply crates. They are hungry, but the crates hold nothing but rusted, bloated cans of C-rations that have been sitting in the heat for far too long. A private cracks one open, recoiling immediately as a foul, metallic stench fills the air. It is the third week of the same rotting supply. 12 men in the company are already crippled by severe stomach cramps and fever. Their commanding officer knows exactly where the fresh food is going, and it is not to his men. He prepares to take his grievances to the very top. A storm is coming for the man responsible for this cruel inventory, and it is going to be led by a general who does not suffer excuses. This is the story of how a supply depot's systemic cruelty toward black infantrymen met its match in the Third Army. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when prejudice met consequences. We bring to life the moments that forced people to face what they had done, exposing the truth behind the myths of military glory. Join us as we examine the moments that changed history. First Sergeant Reginald Moore, 35, from Newark, New Jersey, served as the backbone of his Black Rifle Company. He was a man who believed in the order of the Army and the dignity of the men he led, even when the Army itself often seemed to suggest they possessed neither. Before the war, Moore had worked in a textile mill, learning early that hard labor earned its due, a lesson he brought with him when he enlisted to serve his country. He had seen the war's toll firsthand in the faces of his soldiers, men who fought with grit despite receiving equipment that was often second-rate and supplies that were consistently ignored. His commitment was etched into the pages of his well-worn notebook, where he meticulously recorded the dates, the labels, and the rot of the rations his company was forced to endure. Every entry represented another day of hunger and another soldier laid low by illness, binding him inextricably to the struggle for basic sustenance in a theater of war that sought to starve his men into silence. Master Sergeant Eldon Fowler, 40, ran the supply depot with a rigid, cold efficiency that masked his deep-seated prejudices. Hailing from Wichita, Kansas, Fowler operated under a carefully maintained system of inventory rotation, a code he used to ensure that only the freshest rations reached white units while the bottom of the pile was funneled toward the black infantry companies. He kept his desk spotless and his uniform perfectly pressed, a sharp contrast to the decaying, rusted cans he reserved for those he deemed unworthy of prime stock. Fowler had designated a separate section of his warehouse as the C Reserve, a label that served as his personal shorthand for the segregated distribution of goods. He viewed himself not as a bigot, but as a pragmatist, convinced that his hierarchy of food distribution was simply the natural order of military supply. His polished shoes and crisp, tailored service uniform were the external manifestations of a man who believed that his authority granted him the right to decide who was fit to be fed and who was destined to rot. By July 1944, the Allied advance across France had become a desperate, high-speed race against time and supply lines. The breakout from the Normandy hedgerows had turned into a fluid, rapid push toward the German border, stretching logistical networks to their absolute breaking point. Across the theater, depots were inundated with everything from ammunition and fuel to blankets and food, often struggling to keep pace with the shifting front lines. The chaos of rapid movement meant that supply NCOs possessed immense unchecked power over the daily lives of the men under their shadow. Decisions made in the relative safety of a supply hub determined whether an infantry unit on the front line received hot meals, or, as was often the case, the remnants of stockpiles that had been sitting in the damp French heat for months. In this environment, systemic failures often went unaddressed. Officers were preoccupied with the tactical pressures of the advance, and the sheer volume of troops moving through the region made it easy for inequalities to persist unnoticed or ignored by those in command. While regulations dictated the fair distribution of rations, the reality on the ground was frequently shaped by the biases of the men controlling the crates. For weeks, these logistical bottlenecks provided the perfect cover for a deliberate, discriminatory practice that treated black soldiers as a lower priority for basic survival, effectively denying them the nutrition required to sustain their combat readiness. The breakdown of oversight had allowed a culture of entitlement to fester, with some depots functioning like personal fiefdoms where the rules of the army were bent to serve private prejudices. It was a failure of the command structure that permitted such conditions to persist, leaving the men to bear the physical and mental burden of neglect. The supply depot remained a silent witness to this rot as the sun beat down on the crates in the yard. "Sergeant, I'm here about the rations for the company. We've been opening nothing but rusted cans for 3 weeks now. 12 of my men are down with severe food poisoning. You're in a supply chain, Sergeant. Things get mislaid. You get what's left. I've got the inspection logs here. We're getting the same lot numbers every time. The other companies in our sector are eating fresh meat and fruit. My men are getting whatever is at the bottom of your barrels. They're getting what they're assigned. If you want fresh, you should have pushed harder at the front. This is an efficient rotation system, Sergeant. I don't set the priority. I just manage the inventory. This isn't an inventory issue. It's a choice. I have pictures of these cans, and I have the medical reports for my men. I'm requesting an immediate restock of fresh rations for my company. Request denied. I have my orders on how these supplies are processed, and I don't take suggestions from line infantry on how to run a depot. Your men are lucky they're getting anything at all. Move along." "Sergeant, I am not moving along. This is a clear violation of health regulations. If you refuse to correct this, I am taking this report directly to the Inspector General. Go ahead. You think a general cares about a few rusted cans? You're wasting your breath. I've got a system, and it works exactly the way it's supposed to. My C reserve stock is reserved for specific units, and yours isn't on the list for the good stuff. That's the end of it. You just admitted to segregated rationing. That's not a system, Sergeant. That's a crime. I'm going to the chaplain, and then I'm going to the 3rd Army Command. You're done. Get out of my sight before I have you arrested for insubordination. You're not the first to complain, and you won't be the last. You get what's left, Sergeant. That's the reality of your situation." The conversation ended there, with Fowler turning back to his ledger as if he had just settled a minor clerical error. The first sergeant left the tent, his face set in a hard, grim line. He walked straight to the chaplain, the photographs and the medical reports tucked firmly under his arm. The report reached Patton within the hour. The jeep pulled to a halt in a cloud of thick, gray dust, the engine cutting out with a sharp, mechanical finality. General George S. Patton stepped out, his tall frame cutting a distinct silhouette against the supply depot's stark landscape. 4 stars glinted on his polished helmet, and the ivory-handled revolvers at his waist caught the afternoon light. The air grew heavy. Every man in the yard ceased his movement, the silence spreading from the entrance to the furthest corner of the crates. Patton walked toward the main tent, his pace measured, his eyes fixed on the man who had ordered the rations. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Patton stopped in front of the supply sergeant and gestured to a single, rusted, bloated can of C-rations sitting on the desk. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but biting. "You are the man responsible for the inventory in this depot?" The sergeant straightened, nodding once, his mouth tight. Patton pointed at the can. "Open it." The sergeant hesitated, looking from the general's face to the rusted metal. "Open it." Patton repeated. The sergeant gripped a field opener, his hands trembling as he pierced the lid. A thick, rancid odor wafted into the tent. Patton gestured again. "Eat it." The sergeant recoiled. "I cannot, sir." Patton stared at him for a long moment, the silence amplifying the hum of distant trucks. "You won't eat it? You expect a man to swallow this, but you will not touch it yourself." Patton straightened, turning to address the gathered officers and personnel. "You believe you have created an efficient system. You believe you have mastered the art of rotation. You have done nothing but facilitate the slow, agonizing starvation of your own countrymen. You looked at the color of a man's uniform and decided he was not worth the calories required to keep him in the fight. You decided that some soldiers deserved fresh bread and meat, while others were fit only for the rot of your warehouse floor. You have made your choice. You have prioritized your prejudice over your duty, and in doing so, you have failed every single man who has risked his life for this army. You have two options, and you will choose now. You will take this entire stock of spoiled rations, load them into your own truck, and consume every single can until the inventory is cleared. Or you will face the immediate consequences of your conduct. Comply, or face the punishment. Either way, this depot will be cleaned of your rot, and the men will receive the rations they are owed by sundown. The sergeant stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the floor as Patton waited, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. The sergeant stood frozen, the stench of the open can turning his stomach. He looked at the surrounding soldiers, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of anger and expectation. The inspector general stood by in silence, his clipboard recording the scene. Patton's gaze never wavered. At a nod from the general, two military policemen stepped forward. They marched the sergeant toward a large, filthy staging area near the rear of the depot, where the stacks of expired rations had been hoarded. The sergeant was forced to his knees in the dirt. With a crowd of soldiers watching, he was commanded to begin the work he had neglected. Under the watchful eyes of the 3rd Army Guards, he spent the next 48 hours clearing every single rusted, bloated can from the reserve. He washed the dishes of the infantry company he had starved, standing in the mud until his hands were raw. The soldiers he had mistreated watched from the mess line, their fresh, hot meals finally arriving. The sergeant's uniform, once pristine, was now stained with the grime of his own corruption. By the time he was relieved, the depot's sea reserve was empty, and the warehouse smelled only of soap and scrubbed stone. Reginald Moore returned to his home in Newark after the war, having survived the brutal conditions of the front with a resolve that never wavered. He lived a quiet life, working for decades in the same city where he was raised, and passed away in 1982. He never spoke much of the details of that supply depot, but he kept his old notebook tucked away in a trunk, the pages a testament to the thousands of meals he fought to secure for his men. He remained a man of deep, grounded principle until the end. Eldon Fowler served 5 years of labor for his conduct before his release in 1950. He returned to a quiet, solitary life in Kansas, where he worked as a clerk for the remainder of his years. He was often described by those who knew him as a man of few words and lingering bitterness, never truly reconciling with the nature of his actions or the judgment that had been rendered against him. He died in 1968, leaving behind very little of note beyond the record of his service and the shame of his disgrace. General Patton never spoke about the incident in his public memoirs, nor did he make a habit of recounting it to his staff. However, a single, brief entry in his private correspondence referenced the necessity of maintaining the absolute integrity of supply chains as a matter of fundamental military honor. He kept the Inspector General's final report in a desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the cost of oversight. He knew that the only way to lead was to ensure that justice was felt by those who sought to undermine the men beneath them. Some historians have argued that the incident was merely a localized administrative failure born from the immense pressures of the Allied supply push in the summer of 1944. They suggest that systemic errors were inevitable given the chaotic pace of the advance. Others have argued that such incidents were symptomatic of a broader, deep-seated indifference within the command structure toward the welfare of segregated units. What is certain is that the direct intervention of 3rd Army leadership forced a permanent shift in distribution protocols, ensuring that logistical priority remained tethered to the front line rather than prejudice. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply filed a standard complaint and let the supply chain remain broken? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe.